and members of the Conservative COVID recovery group, leaving the Prime Minister at risk of a backbench revolt. Is there any way they might be able to stop the plan? Andrew Mitchell is a Conservative MP who's opposing the idea of coronavirus passports for the workplace, and he joins us now. What are your concerns?
Good afternoon and happy Easter. Well, we had a lot of these debates over the issues of identity cards some 10 years ago. Parliament looked at it in very great and quite divisive detail and decided against it. And I fully accept we must wait for the results of the Gove inquiry, which the Prime Minister has set up to look at the pros and cons. But I think there's a very grave danger that were we to proceed down this path, it would be a quite extraordinary extension of state power. I think it would exacerbate social division and inequity. I think it would be very bad for social mobility. And it feels really like a form of social apartheid. So I do think that Parliament will want to look very carefully at any proposals, because the arguments that will be mounted against them are intense. And I'd also say this: we've lived through an era over the last year where Parliament has granted to the executive quite extraordinary powers over our civil liberties and over our normal life in order to combat this pandemic. And Parliament hasn't been able really to scrutinise those in the way that we would normally expect to, because of the nature of the pandemic. So I do think that Parliament will want to be extremely careful about granting these sort of powers in the future. And I think they have the capacity to completely change the nature of society.
Would you, though, support the idea of a vaccine passport for international travel then, but not one for use at pubs, theatres or in the workplace here in the UK?
Well, I think that's a different issue. And I do accept that we may need to have, in the way we travel in our passports with yellow fever certificates. I do think it's possible that when we're entering a foreign country with other rules, it could be necessary to do that. But having a state database behind these COVID passports is a very significant extension of state power. And I think that my constituents in Sutton Coldfield would expect us to think very carefully before changing the nature of British society in that way.
This and the policing bill. Do you think that these are examples then of a government that is now hooked on intervention and more state control?
No, I think the principles behind the policing bill are sensible and they will need to be explored. But equally, there are issues there, such as the right of all of us to protest in a normal way, where you do not want to allow too great flexibility in police power in controlling such things. And I'm sure Parliament will want to look at that. But on the policing bill as a whole, I think the Home Secretary has made a very good point about having this legislation.
And what alternative would you put forward instead? Because surely people who run pubs or theatres or employers have a legal responsibility to others going into those venues to keep them safe.
Well, I think the success of the vaccination campaign, extraordinary success, should not be underestimated. It protects the vulnerable and it makes the return to normal life something we can all now start to look forward to. I think it's not an exact analogy, but I think there are analogies with the winter flu vaccinations and the very serious danger for vulnerable people that the flu causes in wintertime. So I think very much that we are, I hope, returning to a form of normal life which will make this debate redundant once we get there. But as I say, I think it's important also to listen to the Gove report when it is produced so that we can all take a thoughtful approach to this. But then I think Parliament is very, very unlikely to agree to something which, as I say, feels very much like a form of social apartheid.
Andrew Mitchell MP, thank you for speaking to us today.